This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Servile State by Hilaire Belloc. Section 10. If you are suffering because property is restricted to a few, you can alter that factor in the problem, either by putting property into the hands of many, or by putting it into the hands of none. There is no third course. In the concrete, to put property in the hands of none means to vest it as a trust in the hands of political officers. If you say that the evils proceeding from capitalism are due to the institution of property itself, and not to the dispossession of the many by the few, then you must forbid the private possession of the means of production by any particular, and by which word property is meant, of course, property in the means of production, the private part of the community. But someone must control the means of production, or we should have nothing to eat. So in practice this doctrine means the management of the means of production by those who are the public officers of the community. Whether these public officers are themselves controlled by the community or no has nothing to do with this solution on its economic side. The essential point to grasp is that the only alternative to private property is public property. Somebody must see to the ploughing and must control the ploughs. Otherwise no ploughing will be done. It is equally obvious that if you conclude property in itself to be no evil, but only the small number of its owners, then your remedy is to increase the number of those owners. So much being grasped, we may recapitulate and say that a society like ours, disliking the name of slavery and avoiding a direct and conscious re-establishment of the slave status, will necessarily contemplate the reform of its ill-distributed ownership on one of two models. The first is the negation of private property and the establishment of what is called collectivism, that is, the management of the means of production by the political officers of the community. The second is the wider distribution of the property until that institution shall become the mark of the whole state, and until free citizens are normally found to be possessors of capital or land or both. The first model we call socialism, or the collectivist state. The second we call the proprietary or distributive state. With so much elucidated, I will proceed to show in my next section why the second model, involving the redistribution of property, is rejected as impractical by our existing capitalist society, and why therefore the model chosen by reformers is the first model, that of a collectivist state. I shall then proceed to show that at its first inception all collectivist reform is necessarily deflected and evolves in the place of what had been intended a new thing, a society wherein the owners remain few and wherein the proletarian mass accepts security at the expense of servitude. Have I made myself clear? If not, I will repeat for the third time, and in its briefest terms, the formula which is the kernel of my whole thesis. The capitalist state breeds a collectivist theory, which in action produces something utterly different from collectivism, to wit, the servile state. Section 7. Socialism, the easiest apparent solution of the capitalist crux. I say that the line of least resistance, if it be followed, leads a capitalist state to transform itself into a servile state. I propose to show that this comes about from the fact that not a distributive but a collectivist solution is the easiest for a capitalist state to aim at, and that yet in the very act of attempting collectivism what results is not collectivism at all, but the servitude of the many and the confirmation in their present privilege of a few, that is, the servile state. Men to whom the institution of slavery is abhorrent propose for the remedy of capitalism one of two reforms. Either they would put property into the hands of most citizens, so dividing land and capital that a determining number of families in the state were possessed of the means of production, or they would put those means of production into the hands of the political officers of the community, to be held in trust for the advantage of all. The first solution may be called the attempted establishment of the distributive state. The second may be called the attempted establishment of the collectivist state. Those who favour the first course are the conservatives or traditionalists. They are men who respect and would, if possible, preserve the old forms of Christian European life. They know that property was thus distributed throughout the state during the happiest periods of our past history. They also know that where it is properly distributed today you have greater social sanity and ease than elsewhere. In general, those who would re-establish, if possible, the distributive state in the place of, and as a remedy for, the vices and unrest of capitalism, are men concerned with known realities, and having for their ideal a condition of society which experience has tested and proved both stable and good. They are then of the two schools of reformers, the more practical in the sense that they deal more than do the collectivists, called also socialists, with things which either are or have been in actual existence. But they are less practical in another sense, as we shall see in a moment, from the fact that the stage of the disease with which they are dealing does not readily lend itself to such a reaction as they propose. The collectivist, on the other hand, proposes to put land and capital into the hands of the political officers of the community, and this on the understanding that they shall hold such land and capital in trust for the advantage of the community. In making this proposal he is evidently dealing with the state of things hitherto imaginary, and his ideal is not one that has been tested by experience, nor one of which our race and history can furnish instances. In this sense, therefore, he is the less practical of the two reformers. His ideal cannot be discovered in any past known and recorded phase of our society. We cannot examine socialism in actual working, nor can we say, as we can say of well-divided property, on such and such an occasion in such and such a period of European history, collectivism was established and produced both stability and happiness in society. In this sense, therefore, the collectivist is far less practical than the reformer who desires well-distributed property. On the other hand, there is a sense in which this socialist is more practical than the other type of reformer, from the fact that the stage of the disease into which we have fallen apparently admits of his remedy with less shock than it admits of a reaction towards well-divided property. For example, the operation of buying out some great tract of private ownership today, as a railway or a harbour company, with public funds, continuing its administration by publicly paid officials, and converting its revenue to public use, is a thing with which we are familiar, and which seemingly might be indefinitely multiplied. Individual examples of such transformation of waterworks, gas, tramways, from a capitalist to a collective basis, are common, and the change does not disturb any fundamental thing in our society. When a private water company or tramway line is bought by some town and worked thereafter in the interest of the public, the transaction is effected without any perceptible friction, disturbs the life of no private citizen, and seems in every way normal to the society in which it takes place. Upon the contrary, an attempt to create a large number of shareholders in such enterprises, and artificially to substitute many partners distributed throughout a great number of the population in the place of the original few capitalist owners, would prove lengthy, and at every step would arouse opposition, would create disturbance, would work at an expense of great friction, and would be imperilled by the power of the new and many owners to sell again to a few. In a word, the man who desires to re-establish property as an institution normal to most citizens in the state is working against the grain of our existing capitalist society, while a man who desires to establish socialism, that is, collectivism, is working with the grain of that society. The first is like a physician who should say to a man whose limbs were partially atrophied from disuse, "Do this and that, take such and such exercise, and you will recover the use of your limbs." The second is like a physician who should say, "You cannot go on as you are. Your limbs are atrophied from lack of use. Your attempt to conduct yourself as though they were not is useless and painful. You had better make up your mind to be wheeled about in a fashion consonant to your disease." The physician is the reformer, his patient the proletariat. It is not the purpose of this book to show how and under what difficulties a condition of well-divided property might be restored, and might take place, even in England, of that capitalism which is now no longer either stable or tolerable. But for the purpose of contrast, and to emphasise my argument, I will proceed, before showing how the collectivist unconsciously makes for the Servile State, to show what difficulties surround the distributive solution, and why, therefore, the collectivist solution appeals so much more readily to men living under capitalism. If I desire to substitute a number of small owners for a few large ones in some particular enterprise, how shall I set to work? I might boldly confiscate and redistribute at a blow, but by what process should I choose the new owners? Even supposing that there was some machinery whereby the justice of the new distribution could be assured, how could I avoid the enormous and innumerable separate acts of injustice that would attach to general redistributions? To say none shall own and to confiscate is one thing. To say all should own and appropriation ownership is another. Action of this kind would so disturb the whole network of economic relations as to bring ruin at once to the whole body politic, and particularly to the smaller interests indirectly affected. In a society such as ours, a catastrophe falling upon the State from the outside might indirectly do good by making such a redistribution possible. But no one working from within the State could provoke that catastrophe without ruining his own cause. If, then, I proceed more slowly and more rationally, and canalise the economic life of society, so that small property shall gradually be built up within it, see against what forces of inertia and custom I have to work today in a capitalist society. If I desire to benefit small savings at the expense of large, I must reverse the whole economy under which interest is paid upon deposits today. It is far easier to save 100 out of a revenue of 1,000 than to save 10 out of a revenue of 100. It is infinitely easier to save 10 out of a revenue of 100 than 5 out of a revenue of 50. To build up small property through thrift, when once the mass have fallen into the proletarian trough, is impossible unless you deliberately subsidise small savings, offering them a reward which in competition they could never obtain. And to do this, the whole vast arrangement of credit must be worked backwards, or let the policy be pursued of penalise undertakings with few owners, of heavily taxing large blocks of shares, and of subsidising with the produce small holders in proportion to the smallness of their holding. Here again you are met with the difficulty of a vast majority who cannot even bid for the smallest share. One might multiply instances of the sort indefinitely, but the strongest force against the distribution of ownership in a society already permeated with capitalist modes of thought is still the moral one. Will men want to own? Will officials, administrators, and lawmakers be able to shake off the power which under capitalism seems normal to the rich? If I approach, for instance, the works of one of our great trusts, purchase it with public money, bestow, even as a gift, shares thereof to its workmen, can I count upon any tradition of property in their midst which will prevent their squandering the new wealth? Can I discover any relics of the co-operative instinct among such men? Could I get managers and organisers to take a group of poor men seriously, or to serve them as they would serve rich men? Is not the whole psychology of a capitalist state divided between the proletarian mass, which thinks in terms not of property but of employment, and the few owners, who are alone familiar with the machinery of administration? I have touched but very briefly and superficially upon this matter, because it needs no elaboration. Though it is evident that with a sufficient will and a sufficient social vitality property could be restored, it is evident that all efforts to restore it have, in a capitalist society such as our own, a note of oddity, of doubtful experiment, of being uncoordinated with other social things around them, which marks the heavy handicap under which any such attempt must proceed. It is like recommending elasticity to the aged. The end of section 10.